Hey everybody, Josh Sigurdson, World Alternative Media here, and we are joined by the one and only Lord Christopher Monckton, 3rd Viscount Monckton of Brenchley, here at G. Edward Griffin's Red Pill Expo here in Bozeman, Montana. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I think we ought to, first of all, say a word of thanks to Ed, who I think he must be at least 85, but he was working until 4:30 this morning on arrangements for this wonderful expo, which begins as we record this tomorrow and goes on for 2 days here in Bozeman, Montana. He put this together on a shoestring, with a few good friends such as Debbie Bacigalupi and of course Dan Happel here in Montana, and between them they've carried the load, and there are going to be close to 600 people here, and this is the first time they've ever organised an event. They've never done it before.
Isn't it incredible? G. Edward Griffin has done incredible work for more than 60 years, and he's still got the agility of someone in his 30s when it comes to just his passion and ambition, and it's an incredible thing to watch.
And for those few who may not have read his great work, The Creature from Jekyll Island is his book on how the Fed was founded by a cartel of bankers so that they could permanently exploit both the federal government and the citizens of the United States simultaneously for their enrichment and for our impoverishment. And his book is a classic of its kind. It's extremely revealing, very balanced, very well written, and it exposes the rotten heart of the money system here in the United States.
It's absolutely a must read. Now, Lord Monckton, last time we spoke with you, actually it was John Snyson who spoke with you in Phoenix last December. You debunked the 97% consensus among scientists regarding climate change and did an incredible job of it. I'd like to ask you a bit about the politics of this globalist regulatory control complex being formed around this anti-science notion of anthropogenic global warming. So I'll start off with countries like Canada pushing a carbon tax. Many on the left think this implementation will stick it to the big corporations. But it seems state monopolization may be one of the goals of this extortion and regulation. So from what you've researched, who actually benefits from the carbon tax? Like, cui bono?
It's very interesting. It is always the vested interest against the general interest when you look at this kind of taxation, which is not based on any sound scientific principle. It's based solely upon hatred originally of the United States coal industry, because the coal owners tended to be very strong financial supporters of the Republican Party. Indeed, they were the major financial supporters of the Republican Party for many decades. And so the original hatred of coal didn't come from the fact that coal emits vast amounts of carbon dioxide, because it doesn't really. It comes from the fact that the coal owners happen to subsidize the Republican Party rather than the Democrat Party. And that is really what this comes down to. That was the original agenda. But then the international communist left, and I'm going to use the word communist because that is what it is. There's no point in faffing around and listening to the people who say, oh, we were just talking about Reds under the beds. The fact is, we now have a communist as head of the Labour Party. He's quite open about it. We have a communist as deputy head of the Labour Party in Britain. You had a communist as your president for 8 years here. You were going to have another communist as your president if Hillary Clinton had won. And there's no point in mincing words. That is, the policies they stand for are communist policies. They may not want to use the word because they know it's still unpopular with the older generation, at least. With the younger generation, alarmingly, because they did not experience the horrors and the murders and the slaughters and economic bankruptcy that was Soviet-style communism. They don't realize that however idealistic it sounds, it is in fact a recipe for universal misery, poverty, disease, starvation, and death. And the only way they're going to learn this, and I agree with Alex Jones on this, is if they are made to experience it for themselves, as they're now going to be. Certainly in Britain, it looks as though there's been an election within months and the Labour Party will win it. And the Labour Party is effectively a communist party in all but name. And it's the young people who've been recruited in their millions by the communist cell structure of the Labour Party, which has been set up by a group called Momentum, that is gradually capturing it there. The Democrats are already sending their people across to learn how the Labour Party did it. They are going to apply the same communist cell structure here to recruiting young people into the Democrat Party, and that will make it very much harder for Trump at the next election unless we do the same. And one of the purposes, therefore, of the Red Pill Expo is to take that red pill that was offered by Morpheus to Neo in the film The Matrix. The red pill was the one that revealed the truth, and the blue pill was the one that allowed you to go to sleep and wake up still under an illusion of truth. And it's not an accident that the colours they chose were as they were, because blue, of course, is the colour of the so-called Democrat Party, which is a paradise of self-delusion. And red is the colour of the Republican Party, which, particularly under Mr. Trump, is very down-to-earth in its pursuit of what is true and right and good. And he starts with a simple and delightful proposition. And it's delightful even to me as a Brit. He wants to put America first. And when he says America, he means working people in America. He wants them to be able to work, and the Rust Belt no longer to rust. Now, this is admirable. He has understood that the left have abandoned the working class. And the working class, who were the original alleged motivation and justification for communism and for international socialism, and indeed for fascism, which are merely two sides of the same extreme left coin, Trump saw that the young people, the working people, were no longer being represented by the communists. And so he moved in straight into their heartlands and captured them. Theresa May tried to do the same, but hey, Theresa May is no Donald Trump. So in our election, it was frankly a bit of a train wreck from the Conservatives' point of view.
But do you think that Donald Trump is really able to get beyond that deep state that he speaks of so often? Because it seems even as he is president at this moment, there is still this massive push by this globalist order, I suppose you could say, that is still in some ways within his cabinet and outside as well, pushing him more towards this communist agenda. Obviously not anywhere close to what it would have been under Hillary Clinton, and nowhere close to what it was under Obama, but all the same still
certainly
pushing.
An accommodation with communism is what some in his cabinet are pushing. One thinks of Donald Trump, one thinks of, not Donald Trump, I'm sorry, I mean Rex Tillerson, the CEO of ExxonMobil, who decided as a matter of strategy when he first became CEO that he was not going to take a line against global warming because he reckoned that he needed not to have the left boycotting his products. And so he took a cynical commercial decision that he would drift along with this garbage. And now he finds he can't change gear. But one of the things that I hope to do at this Red Pill Expo is to give the final piece of a puzzle that I've been studying for 11 years. I knew right from when I was first asked by a hedge fund in London to look into the global warming question, and at that time I thought there was a problem. I had written articles in the papers saying, I've bought a house on Richmond Hill, the rest of you will have to take to the boats because of rising sea level. I was writing all this stuff in the late 1980s. But in 1990, in 2006, I was approached by this hedge fund. They said, could you please just look at this for us and tell us what you think? So I spent a month looking at it and realised it was all nonsense. And so I did a report saying so, and they accepted it and pulled all their clients out of green investments. And now it's champagne every time I see them because I saved them billions, actually, I think, in the end. But I knew right from the start when I began seriously looking at it, because they'd asked me to, that there was a mistake in the mathematics, but I couldn't see what the mistake was. I knew in roughly which part of the calculation of how much warming we're going to get this mistake was. It was in what's called the feedback loop. And I won't bore you with the details of it, but I knew they were doing it wrong. And I couldn't see what they were doing wrong. And it was only just under a year ago that an electronics engineer who had seen a paper that I had published in one of the learned journals saying, I can't find the mistake, but it's obvious that there is one, and here's why. He said, yeah, there is a mistake. You need to read this textbook. So I read a textbook dating back to 1945. Sure enough, there was a mistake, a small one, which he had spotted. He said, but it's an error. I said, it's not an error that makes any difference. I'm going to have a further look. And I read the chapter again on feedbacks, as this is the area of mathematics concerned. And I saw at once that they were feeding into the feedback calculation a number which was 250 times smaller than it should have been in the real world. The result of this was to magnify the effect of feedbacks, to make it look as though, therefore, you were going to get not 1 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2, but at least 1.5, perhaps as much as 4.5, and their best estimate was 3.5. And then the silly extremist communist papers say, well, it might even be 7 or 10 or even 13 Celsius degrees.
Yes.
The paper last year saying it might be 13 Celsius degrees. But this extra from above 1 Celsius degree of warming per doubling of CO2 comes from these feedbacks. And when I eventually worked out what they had done wrong, I kicked myself because it was so startlingly obvious. And yet it's only when I went and read the textbook that I could see what they'd done wrong. And it was only 3 weeks ago, while I was in the bath, that I realized that there was a major implication of this error that I had not previously seen. And so for the first time at this conference, I will be revealing the full extent of the mistake they made. And what it means is, the bottom line is that there will not be more than around 1 Celsius of global warming for every doubling of CO2 concentration. And on any view, that is simply not enough to be worth worrying about.
That's incredible. And we're looking forward to hearing your speech at the Expo this year. And, it's interesting. I have personally confronted the Prime Minister of Canada on the global warming, anthropogenic climate change myth on several occasions. Unfortunately, it didn't go too well for me. You could see that video as well. I got thrown out of the room rather fast. But I did question the Prime Minister on it. And he, this is the same man who he's telling the whole country that all of Canada supports the Paris Climate Agreement. Yeah. It's that communist ideology of I'm the leader, everyone must believe what I believe. And it's what G. Edward Griffin often talks about, that collectivism, really, where they just assume the consensus of the entire nation. And we're seeing that with Corbyn as well, which is quite frightening. And, it's going to continue. There's people like Jared Kushner within the Trump administration who's also...
There is one point
All right.
That I have not yet emphasized. If we are right, and I say if because until it's been peer-reviewed and published and the world scientific community can tear it apart, we can't be absolutely sure that we haven't missed something. But assuming that we haven't missed something, we've taken a lot of steps to make sure that we haven't, and I'll go into those in a moment. What we have done in our submission is to provide a definitive and actually remarkably simple and complete scientific proof, a demonstration by contradiction, which is one of the formal methods of proof in mathematics, that if you take all the other assumptions of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as being gospel, but you merely correct those assumptions for this one large error, then the problem of the climate disappears for certain. And we can prove it. And that changes the dynamic. It's not a probabilistic result. It's not saying, oh, well, the weather has only warmed at half the rate they predicted, therefore they're wrong, because there might be some natural factor, artificially but temporarily depressing the rate of warming that they would have predicted.
Sure.
Instead, we're able to say, using your assumptions, but correcting for your mistake of mathematics, you would not expect to see more than the rate of warming that has actually been observed. Because when you do it our way, the sum comes out more or less exactly to the amount of warming we've actually seen since 1990 when they made their first predictions. And they predicted twice as much as has happened. But if you correct for their mathematics, then our sums get it right and their sums, it's twice as much as it should be.
I think people like yourself should be thanked for the research that you've done into this topic, because I think the main, most important part of science is that skepticism and the being able to objectively look at facts and theories and be able to come to your own consensus about it instead of being told what it is and just saying, well, I'm not going to look at it because I'll be called a denier with all the Holocaust connotations.
That's it. I mean, one does have to be very thick-skinned because the way the left operate, they do not know whether they're right or wrong on the climate. And they just pretend that they're right. And they say, there you are, prove that we're wrong. And actually science does expect us to prove that they are wrong. They can put forward a hypothesis. If we can't prove it's wrong, it gains a certain amount of credibility by the fact that we can't. But now we can prove that it's wrong. I mean, prove that it's wrong. And the proof is remarkably simple. I can do it in 1 minute for you.
Okay, absolutely. I would love to hear it.
Here is the proof that the left are wrong and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is wrong, the Paris Agreement is wrong. The natural greenhouse effect is generally agreed to be 33 Celsius. The surface temperature of the Earth is generally agreed to be 288 Kelvin, and so we'll put the Celsius into Kelvin as well, 33 Kelvin is the natural greenhouse effect. Therefore, the fraction of today's temperature that is accounted for by feedback, if you assume that the whole of the greenhouse effect is caused by feedback, which is pushing things as far as you possibly could in the direction of the climate extremists, then the feedback fraction is obviously 33 over 288, which is less than 0.12, less than 1/8 of the original warming is fed back to cause an amplification. So, their estimate of what the feedback fraction might be, and you'll find this by simply calculating back from the 1.5 to 4.5 Celsius of global warming they say has happened, are between 0.25 and 0.75. That's their values for the feedback fraction. But you'll see that even the lowest of those, 0.25, is more than twice as high as the absolute absurd extreme maximum of 0.12 that we've calculated by reference to assuming that the whole of the natural greenhouse effect is caused by feedbacks. And in that single, simple proof by contradiction, or reductio ad absurdum as it's known in formal logic, we are able to demonstrate the falsity of the official position. And it's then a very simple matter of calculation to produce a new equation to replace the defective equation they use for determining climate sensitivity. And if you use the corrected equation, then the amount of warming you get per doubling of CO2 is just about the same with or without the action of feedbacks. And since feedbacks are thought at the moment to account for 2/3 to 4/5 or even to 9/10 of all warming, removing the feedbacks from the equation limits the global warming to 1 Celsius degree per doubling of CO2. 1.2, 1.3, absolute max. It's not going to be worse than that. Not the 1.5 to 4.5 that they say were the best estimate of 3.5. No, it's not going to be more than 1.2 to 1.3. More likely to be less even than that. And that is a formal proof. That's what they're going to find very hard to demolish.
Wow. That's incredible. And obviously you've done more research than I think most people out there have, because you've had, I suppose you could say, the guts, for lack of a better word, to actually look into these things that so many people haven't. But obviously there's a lot of people that have been working alongside you, and people that have...
Oh yes, I mean the paper we have written has 7 co-authors, and they are people of undoubted eminence. We have, for instance, Dr. Willie Soon, who's got a brain the size of Jupiter. He is an astrophysicist, first-class astrophysicist, no less, an award-winning astrophysicist at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. Very much a top scientist. We have Professor David Lee Gates, who is a professor of climate change and geography and related matters at the University of Delaware. We have Dr. Matt Briggs, who is one of the world's most eminent statisticians, doing the statistical end of things for us. We have not one but 2 electronic engineers so that we get the feedback calculations right. Dr. Michael Limberg from Germany, who holds I don't know how many degrees in electronic engineering. Again, a brain the size of the planet, and a very charming man with it. We have John Whitfield in the UK, who actually built a test circuit so that we could test the numbers for ourselves. And then in addition to all of those, we have an undergraduate at the University of East Anglia who has helped us with simplifying and clarifying the argument so that everyone, including undergraduates, can understand it. It's a very important part of what we're doing. And so these are, and also we have the greatest expert in Britain on the electricity supply industry. And he has been very helpful in shaping the paper as well. So these are distinguished co-authors. So it's not just me saying, oh, I think this is the case. We have these co-authors who all think it's the case. But then we did 2 other things. We went to Professor Will Happer at Princeton, who's arguably the world's most eminent practicing physicist. An astonishing man. And we said, here is our paper. And he threw it back at me and said, it's too long. So I had to rewrite it in shorter form. And then he wrote back and he said, in that characteristically forthright and blunt way that he has, I like this paper. Then we sent it to Professor Ray Bates at University College Dublin, who is the world's foremost expert on the application of feedback mathematics to the climate, and he is, or at least was, on the other side of the debate. But when I debated against him on the issue of the climate in front of the Law Society of Ireland 5 years ago, he struck me as an honest man. And when he was asked by a communist in the audience, why do you even agree to appear on a platform with this toxic lunatic Monckton, he went to the microphone and he said, it must be as apparent to all of you as it is to me that Monckton is profoundly knowledgeable on this subject, and I am going to have to go away as a result of what he said and rethink my position. And you could have heard a pin drop, and the communist was completely deflated. But that was an honourable man. I mean, it takes a lot of guts to do that. And he then spent 3 years rethinking his position. Then he wrote to me and he said, actually, I've now published a paper which says, I think I can't see what they've done wrong either, but I can see that they've done something wrong, and I've said so. So then I carried on for a further year, and we finally found what they've done wrong. And it's a lulu, as I say, they're putting in a value to the calculation which is 1/250th of what it should be. They're putting in only the change in temperature before feedback, which is 1 Celsius, rather than the total absolute surface temperature of 288 Kelvin. So that it's screwed up big time. It's a really serious mistake, actually. And it doesn't have consequences 250 times as big. It sort of evens itself out as it goes around the loop, but it still leaves you with this very big error. And if you correct for the error, it means you don't have to worry about what are called temperature feedbacks, amplifying the direct warming caused by the CO2. So it's important to understand also that we are not saying there's no such thing as a greenhouse effect. We're not even saying it doesn't have as much of an effect on the temperature as they say. We're saying it's direct effect. We're happy to work with their estimate. We have some reason to suspect, but cannot prove that too is an exaggeration. Professor Happer has proved that it's an exaggeration, in which case then our 1.2 Celsius per doubling of CO2 comes down to 0.8. And he is very likely to be right because he is very eminent and very careful. They're already trying to attack him, so I guess they realise he's right. And you put all this together and CO2 becomes, as it has always been, a bit part player. It makes a contribution to the climate, but a beneficial one. It is plant food, it's good for plants, and in fact the planet has greened enormously in the last 20 or 30 years as a result of there being a bit less of the CO2 starvation that there had been before. 180 parts per million, and plants start curling up and dying.
Well, absolutely. During the medieval warming period, we saw a vast amount of plant life growing and a vast expansion of plant life in the world. And we also have to mention, the mini ice age in the seas of Britain in the 1600s. I mean, this isn't something that is...
And we're still recovering from that, of course, and that's why you're still seeing temperatures rising. Part of that is recovery from the Little Ice Age, as it's called, in the 1600s. And interestingly, in Britain, we had the first temperature record for a whole region. It was most of the England and a bit of Scotland. And it's known as the Central England temperature record. It's much bigger than just Central England. And it acts as a fairly good proxy for global temperature change because we're at the right latitude, and we can tell because we've now got that record running in parallel with the global record. They march more or less in lockstep. And if you go back to 1694, you're too young, but if you go back that far, and then you go 40 years on to 1733, the rate of global warming as measured by the Central England rate of temperature increase was equivalent to 4 Celsius degrees per century. Now, in the whole of the 20th century, there's been no period of 40 years, or the 21st for that matter, no period of 40 years in which the rate of warming has been much more than half of that. Now, there's no way back in 1694 that we, humanity, there were too few of us. We weren't burning fossil fuels at the rate we are now. There's no way we could have made any difference. This was a natural recovery of solar activity after a period of decline, and the sun waxes and wanes like this. We know this from the oldest climate record the world has got, which is the Nilometer record in Egypt. That goes back 7,000 years, and you can see these amazing cycles of drought and flood in the Nile, which were caused by changes in the sun. And now we can do measurements of beryllium-10 in various kind of rocks to establish what the solar activity was. And we can correlate that with the nilometer record. It's kind of great detective feat using the paleoclimate to work out what went on. And so we've seen these huge changes in the past. And the changes we've seen in the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century are nothing in comparison to what has happened even in quite recent history. As I say, 1694, 1733, not that long ago. But it looks as though global temperatures at that time, certainly Central England temperatures, which are a good proxy for global temperatures, went up at something like twice the maximum rate that has been seen at any period since. And we could not have been to blame. And so that means attributing, as between us and nature, the causes of the warming is something that we do not have enough information to do. And so when a paper came out in 2013, you raised this point about consensus earlier, this paper came out in 2013 saying there's a 97.1% consensus that recent warming was mostly man-made. That was how one of the authors actually put it in a public relations statement put out by his university. And the paper itself says something similar. I read the paper and I said, I want to see the data. And I had to spend 3 weeks badgering them until they would give me a copy of the data file in which they'd listed the 11,944 papers on climate and related subjects published in the scientific journals, the learned journals, in the 21 years from 1991 to 2011. And they had themselves put a little number from 1 to 7 against each line, one line for each of these papers with the title, the author, what it was about, and then a number. That number was how they ranked it. And the number 1 was that paper had explicitly stated in its abstract, the summary at the beginning, that recent warming was mostly man-made, or in recent decades the man's contribution is larger than nature, or words to that effect. And guess how many papers they had actually marked out of 11,944 as stating explicitly that recent warming was mostly man-made?
How many?
64. Not 6,400, 64. Which you can do the sum, and the answer is trembling on your lips, 0.5% of the entire sample. He got there, you see, he got there. But when we read those 64 papers, we found that only 41 of them had actually said what they'd said. And therefore the actual consensus that we can say for reasonably certain that recent warming was mostly man-made is 0.3% in the peer-reviewed literature, which is the only place worth measuring. If you go to a communist scientist and you ask him the question, he will trot out the party line. That is valueless. It's only after it's been through peer review that you can count his view as really having any merit, and even then you've got to be careful. And if you go through the peer-reviewed papers, 0.3% is the consensus on the official consensus proposition, which is that recent warming is mostly man-made. We published that result in a peer-reviewed paper of our own. But the interesting thing is you still hear politicians and the so-called Marxstream media endlessly trotting out the 97% consensus figure. As far as I can recall, not a single mainstream news medium has ever revealed our peer-reviewed study, which in the most basic and complete way demonstrated that figure should actually, using their own analysis, have been 0.3%. And that's the prejudice we're dealing with. But here is the point. On the mathematical question of whether they are calculating the amount of global warming correctly, if we can prove that they've made a large error of physics there, and we think we can, we think we have proved that, and so do those who have reviewed this paper for us, they think we're right. We've done one other thing. We went to a national physical laboratory, I can't say which, because we haven't yet got their permission for us to say that they did this for us, and we gave them 30 calculations to do. And we asked the answers. They had to build an electronic circuit, feed particular levels of current in at different parts of the circuit to simulate the original temperature going in, the amplification of it caused by the CO2, and then the feedbacks caused by water vapor and so forth. And we gave them numbers that they could put into their circuit. And then using ordinary standard feedback theory, what did they measure as coming out? And we had given them a list. We said, we predict that this is the values you will get out. And now you go ahead and do it. And 2 days ago, they came back to me and they said that each one of the 30 tests we'd given them, the results had come out to 1/10 of a point, to exactly what we had said that they would be. So we do understand the theory behind this. Now, of course, that laboratory can't yet say that therefore we have proven that global warming has got it wrong.
Yeah.
The official global warming is wrong. But they can at least say that we have understood the theory behind our own argument.
Sure.
And therefore, the one area where the other side can't attack is on the theoretical basis. On the theoretical basis, we're right. They're going to have to find something else to shoot this down. And I have been trying to think what that might be, and I can't think of anything. Doesn't mean there isn't anything. But I think we are trembling on the verge of bringing the entire global warming gravy train up against the buffers. It's going to stop. Because a mathematical proof of the simplicity that I outlined to you earlier is something which, in the end, even if the climate scientists tried to gang up and say, no, you've got it wrong, people in other branches of science, such as electronic engineering, such as network analysis, such as process engineering, such as control theory, all of these people who are dealing with exactly these issues all the time and have never really looked at the climate because the climate modelers are so obscure in the way they do things. It's very hard to find out what they're doing.
Certainly.
They will realise from our paper that the climate modelers have simply been doing it wrong. And they will start saying, look, this is a joke. Stop trying to go on saying we're going to get lots of warming. We're obviously not. We're going to get warming at half to a third of the rate that was predicted, and that's not enough to be a problem. And so that's why we think that once this paper is published, and of course they'll try to stop it being published, but in the end that you can't deny the truth indefinitely in science. It will find its way through, just as it did after eugenics in Nazi Germany and after Lysenko's mad theories of soaking seed corn in water over the winter instead of planting it out so it could acclimatize itself to the temperature. And he that led to 20 years of failed harvest. 20 million people died directly from this madness. But ultimately the truth, albeit after a lot of loss of life, came through. The same will be the case here. You can't deny the truth. And when it is here, as it is, as we think here, actually quite a simple proof on a piece of theory which we have now established by experiment, we understand. I think it's going to be very, very hard for the usual suspects any longer to pretend that global warming is a problem. They're going to have to fall back on their backstop position, which is ocean so-called acidification. And the most telling figure that I've seen on that is in a book by Gregory Wrightstone, who is a petroleum engineer here in the States, a very able one. And he has written an excellent, very simple kind of plain man's guide to the inconvenient facts, as he's calling it, of global warming. And he has looked at this ocean acidification question, and there were virtually no papers on it up until 2005, when the first few, about half a dozen of them appeared. And then there was a sudden explosion over the next decade, and now it's about 600 papers a year coming out on the subject. It's all Me Too publishing. And once we've dealt with the global warming aspect of adding CO2 to the atmosphere, we think that our team will probably then turn to learning the necessary chemistry to understand Henry's law, which governs the balance between CO2 in the atmosphere and CO2 in the ocean, and its link with changes in temperature, because it's quite complicated. But once we've boiled that down to what is the essential formula, I think we're going to find that you're not going to get that much of a change in the acid-base balance of the oceans as we add CO2 to the atmosphere. There will again be some. It'll be like the warming. You get some warming and you'll get some. You won't get acidification. Even if you did, it wouldn't matter. And that's a very interesting thing because, again, you're far too young to remember, but 54 million years ago, for a period of around 1,200 years, the oceans briefly became acid. I say briefly, 1,200 years.
You look pretty good for someone who was around back then.
Well, there you are. I've withered well. But the point is that it was acid. Now, let us think of some critters that are now said to be terribly fragile and they're all going to curl up and die because of the acidification of the oceans. Take the corals, for instance. Now, the two major species of coral that we have are, as you know, the calcite corals, which evolved in the Cambrian era. It was on the tip of your tongue, and that was 550 million years ago. Sure. And then, of course, the more delicate aragonite corals, which first achieved algal symbiosis and therefore came into existence approximately 175 million years ago in the Triassic era. And, of course, both of those periods, 550 million years ago and 175 million years ago, are a long way before this episode of acidification, real acidification of the oceans. It became about as acid as urine. It's not very, but it's a little bit. And these corals survived. There was one species of coral that didn't, and that was the scleractinian corals. They seem to have gone out of existence at or round about that time, though we don't know whether it's because of acidification that they did disappear. But you can pretty much take it that the corals that are surviving now, they are not going to mind a little bit of acidification. And as proof of that, you look at the Great Barrier Reef, where my brother dives once a year with his three strapping lads. And they've said they've never seen the coral looking so well. And they do this every year, so they've got a fair idea. They swim over quite a lot of it, and they have a look at it, and they say it's really doing fine. There's bits of it here and there which are bleached, because if you get sudden changes in temperature, the coral as a defence mechanism will bleach, and then it'll recover once the temperature stops changing so violently.
Sure. And
likewise, the reef is near the outflow of, for instance, the Brisbane River. It's a bit further north, but you get massive amounts of water. If you get a flood in the Brisbane River, as they got in 2011, enormous amounts of rainwater come out. Now, our rainwater, is it alkaline or is it acid?
Alkaline.
No, it's acid.
Is it?
It's 5.4. It's pronouncedly acid. 7 is neutral.
Yeah, so
seawater is 8.
Yeah.
Rainwater is 5.4. That's really quite acid. And yet, this vast amount of acid water pouring into the alkaline ocean is not enough to affect the corals at all. They don't mind this. They're used even to sudden changes like that. So the suddenness of the change that they say is going to be damaging isn't. And the extent of the change is certainly not going to be, because if you plot even on the very few measurements that have been taken of how very slowly the alkalinity is declining by tiny, tiny amounts, it would take, at the present rate of going, a good 200 years before you got anywhere near neutrality, let alone it becoming acid. And of course, these sea creatures are perfectly capable of making their shells and maintaining them just as they do now, because most of the shell-making creatures make their shells in an internal environment where they control the pH of the process directly, regardless of what it is in the ocean. Now, these kind of facts, which we've only just begun looking at this, and we've found this out already, but you hear none of this in the so-called Markstream media. They will not do their homework. They know what the party line is that's been handed down to them, and they simply go on trotting it out faithfully like a mantra. And that's why they're losing elections. It's because when they say they're doing fact check on us and it's all politics, and when they never do the research on things like global warming, they just trot out the party line and nothing else.
Just regurgitation.
People are no longer going to listen to them seriously. And it doesn't matter how often they whine, as they whined this morning on CNN about how terrible Trump was. People, and he's right about this, he made a wonderful speech in Iowa yesterday in which he said, it's not working, guys. You can attack me personally. It's water off a duck's back. I don't mind. I'll just call you out as the creeps and false fake news merchants that you are. It doesn't hurt me. It hurts you, because nobody can believe you anymore. And that's their problem. Nobody now believes the left-wing media because they have been so relentlessly, sullenly unwilling to put both sides of the argument and treat the readers like adults and let them make up their own minds.
Yeah.
And this is a big failing on the part of the left. They will insist on shouting at people, saying, this is the party line, you're not allowed to disagree. Homosexuality, abortion, Islam, climate change, whatever it might be. They have a Communist Party line, they know what the line is, and if you try to say, well, maybe homosexuality is a bad idea because it's dangerous for its practitioners, it's actually more dangerous than smoking, objectively speaking, perhaps we ought to at least warn homosexuals that it is dangerous so that they can make allowance and decide what they do. They will shriek with fury and say that you're a homophobe. Yeah. And of course you're not, you're actually a homophile. You're saying we don't want them to kill each other or kill themselves. Well, we would like them to know the dangers so that they can deal with them in a sensible way. But you try and say sensible points like that to the left. Oh, he's just an outrageous homophobe. And same with climate change. Try to say, well, actually, the oceans were acid 54 million years ago. It's in the literature. You can read it in the peer-reviewed papers. And they say, no, we don't want to know that. The fact is ocean acidification is going to kill all the creatures. No. It's not. It didn't then, and so it's not going to now.
Absolutely. There should always be debate on these issues, and never, covering your ears, your eyes, and your mouth. And I think that's kind of what we're looking at with left-wing media. I think is synonymous with
they are
media.
Monkeys. They are the three monkeys.
Absolutely.
Hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. They just won't engage in debate. And do you know why they won't? Because they'll lose. because they haven't done their homework. They know they haven't done their homework. You see, they don't know that they're wrong on climate change. Most of them, they will by the time we finish with them, but at the moment they don't know that they're wrong. But they don't know that they're right either. And they lie to the effect that this is more certain than anything ever. And now we're going to prove them that what was more certain than anything ever was simply wrong.
And they're already losing. At this point in time, only about 6% of people actually trust the mainstream media when polled, and that's been repeated time and time again. And it's looking to it's looking like alternative medias, independent medias, are set to surpass mainstream medias in the next 2 years at the rate that independent medias online are going up in viewership and mainstream medias are going down in viewership because people
and the mainstream
have
media
the
are killing
exposure.
themselves by being so relentlessly anti-democratically one-sided. You see, democracy can only work if people are given fairly both sides of the argument and then allowed to decide for themselves. But when you get Marxist organisations like the BBC, for instance, which now has managed to rewrite its own policies so that they can say, well, there's a consensus on climate change. On anything there's a consensus among suitable experts. We don't have to give the other side. How stupid are they going to look? When our proof comes out that the consensus that they say existed, in fact never did exist, but even to the extent it did exist, it was simply wrong. And they wouldn't allow the alternative point of view to be put.
Eventually it'll look like the same people yelling the earth is flat, the earth is flat, the earth is flat until they're proven the earth is definitely not flat.
And here's an interesting thing. You see, it's they who are the flat earthers, these people. And I've been looking at the flat earth arguments to see how it is that they've managed to fool themselves. And of course they've had to build an enormously elaborate construct. It's more than faintly absurd, but and they say, well, of course, the Earth is round, but it's like a flat plate. And then there's a wall of ice around Antarctica, that's the edge of it, and then the North Pole is at the centre, and then everything else in between. And the Sun goes halfway between the North Pole and the South Pole, and that's why you get the tropics being hot and the North and South Poles being cold. And the Sun is only 3,000 miles away, which is why the angles of incidence still come out right on the flat. I mean, they worked it all out, except how do you prove that they are wrong? And it's by working out how one could prove that they were wrong that I realised we could do the same with climate if we could find the right proof. And how can you prove that in that scenario I've just described they are wrong? It's actually not easy. You have to find something where they would be forced into admitting that the description of events that they have is definitely wrong. And the best way to do that is to say, right, stand at the North Pole. Which way do the stars appear to be circulating? Now, if you go anywhere else on a flat plate that's circulating like a disk, the stars will continue to be rotating in the same direction as they were at the North Pole, won't they? Except that on a sphere, if you go to the other side of the sphere, the stars will appear to be rotating in directly the opposite direction. That's it. And the moment you say that to a flat earther, he goes back to whoever nincompoop he got it from. He said, can you answer this? And they can't, of course. But until somebody does that, they can go along with putting out their garbage, and nobody can stop them. And so that's what we had to do with the climate. We had to find, I knew there was this error, but where it was very difficult to find until I reread the textbook, and then bang, there it was. But we've done the same now with the climate as we can do with the flat earthers. We can say there is this one circumstance which demonstrates that you're wrong. You can take the entire natural greenhouse effect, all 33 Celsius of it, as being attributable to feedback, and therefore 33 out of the 288 Kelvin of today's temperature is attributable to the feedbacks acting today, which will then act on anything you want to put on, like CO2. It's the same feedbacks that are acting today, they will also act on those. So then you work out that 33 over 288 is less than 0.12, and that their feedback range is 0.25 to 0.75. Case closed.
Absolutely. And I wanted to...
Just as with the flat earthers, you see, they are, once you see this argument, they are now, the climate science, they are as much flat earthers as the flat earthers are, in that they will be repudiating an obvious and very clear argument, which has not, admittedly, hitherto been available, which demonstrates that they are simply wrong, and wrong to a very large degree.
Oh, absolutely. And unfortunately, I've done a lot of research into the flat Earth theory because again, unfortunately, it's growing at a very vast scale, and I've watched the documentaries. It gave me a bit of a headache, but I watched them, and it's nonsense. You can prove it just by the sunset at night and the shadows on the clouds. But with that said, I don't want to ponder too much on the flat Earth theory.
Except that I submit that the proof I have offered that it's wrong is very clear. You see, there's no doubt about it. If you're on a plate that is rotating, or the stars are rotating around it, then they'll all rotate in the same direction. They won't suddenly go the opposite direction when you get towards the edge of the plate. They'll still be going in the same direction. But on a sphere, once you go past the equator down the other side, then the rotation will appear to be in the opposite direction, and there'll be a different lot of stars you're looking at.
Sure.
And it's the fact that there's a different lot of stars and they're rotating in the other direction that completely and very clearly, in a few sentences, demolishes the flat Earth theory. And one of the things that I find extraordinary about things like the flat Earth theory is that it's very easy just to be sniffy about it, so nobody actually bothers to go to the trouble of explaining to these poor saps why it is that this careful construct that they've contrived is barking mad, it's simply wrong, it's inconsistent with observable reality. And the same, of course, now applies with the climate. We've got them in the same position as we've got the flat earthers in. And what I'm arguing for here, and why I think it is worth having a bit of a conversation about these flat earthers, is that there is a flight from rationality that goes with totalitarianism. If we go back to the philosophy of Anaximander, for instance, in ancient Greece, he was always drawing the distinction between that which is and that which is not. In Greek, to on and to me on. And to him, and to a very large extent also in the Christian religion, the distinction between that which is and that which is not, that which is true and that which is false, is coterminous with the distinction between that which is good and that which is evil. And when you see a whole lot of barking mad ideas like global warming catastrophe and the flat Earth, suddenly all emerging at the same time, then I'm reminded of a wonderful line in C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength. If you've never read that trilogy, you must, because it will shed light on what's going on today. So he's a great popular theologian, writes in plain English, rattling good yarns apart from everything else. And the best of the three is the last of the three. It doesn't usually work that way, but it is That Hideous Strength. And the character of Merlin, who appears in this, decides that he will cast a spell on a whole lot of leftists who are trying to destroy Britain. And so at a big dinner where they're all assembled, he simply says, Qui verbum Dei contempserunt, eis auferetur etiam verbum hominis. From those who have spurned the word of God will be taken the speech of men. And from that moment they all start speaking gibberish without being aware that they're speaking gibberish. They're aware that everybody else is speaking gibberish. They're not aware that they themselves are speaking. And the whole thing descends into gibberish, and they all fight each other and kill each other. That's the end of the left. And that's how he did it. He saw that in the end they will speak so much gibberish that everybody will be able to see that they're wrong. And what we are doing in our researches in the climate, what you were doing on your researches in the flat earth thing, is helping this process of the truth, because the sooner the truth is reasserted, the fewer people will be killed, because the awful thing about departure from truth is that it causes mass loss of life. I'm going to give you a little example from the climate. In Britain in 2011, we had 1 month in which there was no wind, so all the wind turbines produced 0% electricity. And the sun shone, and there was snow on the ground on the whole of the British Isles, never been seen by the satellites before. It was really cold. And 7,000 more people died in that month than would normally die in an entire winter from cold weather. And they died not so much because their homes were cold, as because, not because the weather was cold, rather, as because their homes were cold, because they could no longer afford to heat them because of the tripling of electricity and heating oil prices. Tripling which doesn't arise from a tripling in the raw material price, because actually it's gone down by about 50 to 60% in the last 10 to 20 years. So we should now be paying less than ever for our electricity, for our gasoline, but no, we're paying 3 times as much. Why? Solely because of global warming hysteria and the mad policies that have been rushed into place by totalitarian regimes, including Western ones, who love to meddle and to meddle by saying we are saving you from yourselves, very much at your expense. And in fact, they're not. They're killing people by overcharging them for electricity. And it's a poll tax in particular on the poor, because they have to pay the same price for electricity as the rest of us. And they can't afford it, so they die. And I don't think it's right that these climate change apocalypticists should be allowed to kill poor people in their thousands every cold winter, simply because they will not do the science and get the math right. And so I think that it is right now that we should begin to be a little angry, just as the Lord of Life was angry with the money changers in the temple, because they'd completely missed the point of what the temple was for. And these people have completely missed the point, and indeed the word for sin in ancient Greece was amartia, and the alpha privative there, meaning a missing of the point. It's not so much a deliberate doing of wrong as a carelessness about whether you're doing wrong or not. And that's been the approach of these climate scientists. They've all said, well, the Communist Party line is clear. If we want to advance in academia, we must reflect and parrot the Communist Party line, otherwise we will be punished for it. And they've gone along with it. And to the extent that they are under intolerable pressures. I mean, Willie Soon has suffered agonies because he's dared to write papers with me, for instance, agonies from his professional colleagues. To the extent that they are put under pressure and therefore they do the wrong thing, well, one hopes that the mercy of the Almighty will be extended to them. But to the extent that they are cynically and deliberately, falsely saying that they are certain about this when we now know they couldn't have been because they simply screwed up, to that extent they are lying. And a lie is a complete departure from the truth. It's the most immoral thing, and every immoral act originally derives from a lie. And in philosophy, in particular the philosophy of logic, which is now a very well worked out formal subject, it was first created more or less whole and entire by Aristotle in his prior and posterior analytics. But then it was developed, of course, in the Middle Ages by people like Francis Bacon and so forth. And now we have mathematical logic. And the fundamental principle of logic, which you will curiously almost never see stated in any textbook on logic, not even Lemon, the great work that they use in Oxford, or Hodges, the popular version for mathematical logic, they don't state the central principle of logic, which is that everything that is true is consistent with everything else that is true, and inconsistent with everything that is false.
Wow.
And that's the whole premise on which the whole of science operates. And it is a profoundly moral premise. You have to try to get at what is true, or science cannot function at all. So the moment you politicize it, as the Nazis did with eugenics and killing the Jews as an excuse, and then you had the same with Lysenko and 20 million people dying of starvation. You had the Great Leap Forward under Mao Zedong, again, bogus science, 33 million people killed and another 30 million deaths prevented, births that would have happened prevented by starvation. All of these things were deliberate, willful refusals to do science by hearing both sides and studying it carefully and not shutting down dissent. Because you have to allow the matter to be examined in the round, as they say in China, from every aspect, so that you can eventually get a clear picture. And they don't allow that. Increasingly, the totalitarian left, here and worldwide, are shutting down debate. And the task for us on the centre-right, we who are libertarians, and who above all else are defined by our belief in trying to find the objective truth, that which is true whether you or I or anyone thinks it's true, that's what defines us. We have to make that distinction between us and them clear to them and to their potential supporters, so that then it becomes a matter of whether you are on the side of truth or of not caring about the truth.
Absolutely.
And if we get that distinction into the minds of young people who do have a moral sense, albeit a rather warped one if they've been got at by the left, if we can start making them realise that the left are about denying people the chance to find out what is true, because the party line simply states what's true and you have to go along with it. And the right, which says, well, we are always ready to examine our position, but we think the truth is this because of the following inquiries we've made, which is the position I'm in. Eventually, we can present this to young people, because we've got to capture young people.
Absolutely.
As a moral choice between that which is not true and is therefore likely to lead to evil consequences, and that's the left, and that which is trying to find the truth and is therefore much less likely to lead to evil and much more likely to lead to good and to be in harmony with all truth. And that is the end and object of science as of religion.
Absolutely.
And that is how we should be appealing to young folk.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not doing it. At the moment, it's all dry macroeconomics. I'm all for explaining macroeconomics to people, but it's got to be more than that. There has to be an emotional attachment and devotion to the search for truth. And that's why we believe in freedom, including freedom of speech. It's because without freedom of speech, you can silence those who are like me trying to find the truth. And they've tried to silence me. They've threatened me with death. They've threatened me with hanging. They've threatened me with putting my mouth on the tailpipe of a car and turning on the engine. All sorts of, and they do this to climate skeptics everywhere. There's a Schwarzenegger video on YouTube saying he wants skeptics to put their mouths to the tailpipe of a truck.
Bill Nye wants you in jail. Yeah.
No, he wants us dead.
Yeah.
And that's what they're saying increasingly. Now that is a denial of the way the world is supposed to work. We have been given intelligence. And if you look at the three faculties of the soul in traditional Christian theology, they are the memory, the understanding, that's the faculty of reason, and the will. And the central one is the faculty of reason, just as the central person of the Trinity is the Lord of life himself. And so it is that you have this parallel between the three faculties of the soul and the three persons of the Trinity. But the faculty of reason is absolutely central to what we are. It's what marks us out from the beasts. They, to the extent that they have the faculty of reason at all, is an extremely limited degree as far as we can see. But we have it in its fullness. We have the capacity to reason. But any form of totalitarian government, whether it be religious, whether it be philosophical, whether it be political, which denies people the chance to think for themselves and inquire honestly to try to find what the truth is, that restriction of truth by totalitarian rigidity is evil. And we have to convey that to young folk so that they don't just find themselves indoctrinated by people who, even if they are not themselves intending to be evil, are evil in that they are saying only one point of view, and that is the point of view of the Communist Party, is acceptable on these matters, and you must not think anything else or ever make an inquiry about it.
Absolutely. And we will have to wrap up the interview, unfortunately, but I just wanted to make a few quick points as we wrap it up, because you talk about a lot of these cultural Marxists that we see in the streets today. And I think a lot of them will say you should punch a Nazi, but their definition of a Nazi is basically anyone that disagrees with the establishment point of view. And interestingly enough, I would go as far as to say that Hitler himself was more of a globalist than he was a nationalist, based on the fact that he wanted to spread his borders worldwide. And I would just point out that when it comes down to what the Democratic Party has done over the years, they were in favor of slavery, Jim Crow laws, the KKK, segregation. They were the so-called racist party. They most identified with the Nazi Party. They were further towards the line of National Socialism than, say, libertarians, people that are literally the opposite. They want freedom versus this collectivist coercion of all individuals under one umbrella and told what to say, do, believe. And I think that it would be good to wrap it up in the sense that, do you think that these cultural Marxists will be able to continue to muzzle free expression, or do you think they will continue to shoot themselves in the foot?
It is for us, first of all, to get the truth out on everything from the flat earth to the climate change nonsense. And then, as I say, to add this philosophical dimension, where we say to young people, if you are being made to toe a party line, you should realize that that is wrong. It is a denial of your very humanity. It's denial of what marks you out from the beast. It's a denial of your faculty of reason to tell you you're not allowed to use it, and you must just toe the line. And I was at King's College, Cambridge. You might end on this. I was at King's College, Cambridge about this time. It was in October last year. It was just before Mr. Trump's election. And the subject for the Politics Society's discussion was, does Trump have a point? Mm-hmm. There were 5 people on the panel. One of them was the deputy editor of The Spectator, who was a bit of a... He found Trump distasteful, so he wasn't really enthusiastic about him. And the other 3 were Marxist lecturers at Cambridge, of all places. Marxist lecturers, openly so. And of course they saw no point in Trump. And I was the only person there that saw any point in Trump. And I said, one may not like the language of the locker room that he uses when mm-hmm. talking about women behind their backs. That is not very grown up. Mm-hmm. But there's more to him than that, or he wouldn't have got where he has. And I asked them 4 questions. 1, would you have voted for Brexit if you were old enough? And 2, do you think we should have stronger defence? Do you think we should, number 3, do you think we should have better controlled immigration? And number 4, do you think that climate change has been more than somewhat exaggerated? All those 4 things, Trump has the view that you and I share. And the percentages that I forecast for those 4 questions were 10, 5, 5 and 5. That was the percentage who would support Trump in that audience of supposedly the brightest people in Britain, undergraduates. Actually, it was 5, 3, 2 and 1 out of the 100 people in the room, respectively. 5 of them only said they would have voted for Brexit. 3 of them said they wanted stronger defence. 2 of them said they wanted immigration to be better controlled. And only 1 said that perhaps climate change had been exaggerated. Mm. So I rounded on them, and it's their reaction which is so interesting. I rounded on them, and I said, how is it that you, who are the brightest and best in the land, or supposed to be, all robotically think exactly the same, very nearly all of you, on these 4 widely differing political subjects? Mm-hmm. Why is that? I said, I'll tell you why. It's because you have been thoroughly, persistently, insidiously indoctrinated at school and at university, and probably some of you at home as well. And that indoctrination has been so universal and so complete that you have been, until this moment, entirely unaware of how you have been made to think the same way on all of these subjects. Mm. And they were furious. Furious because they began to realise I might actually be right.
Yeah, maybe they're not the so-called new French resistance.
And I think they're beginning, and what we have to do, therefore, we have to get into the universities. Mm-hmm. And we have to start saying to the students, you must learn to think for yourselves. If anybody tells you you must follow a party line or else, that proposition is evil. Mm-hmm. You have to have the freedom and keep the freedom to think for yourselves, search for yourselves, and find honestly the true answer to these questions. Mm-hmm. You must not take them as handed down wisdom from a church or a government or a political faction. You must learn to think independently for yourselves. Mm. And if we can get that idea of thinking independently into the young people again as being something which is attractive, sexy, and morally right, appealing to their idealism, saying, actually, it's better for the world if you think for yourselves than if you parrot some ghastly party line. Then the left will fail, and they will fail utterly and forever, because the moment we recover the use of reason at the centre of how humanity operates, the moment we get back to that and away from party lines, in that moment we start to solve the problems of our own making on this planet, and we will become a happier and more harmonious place. And I think that is worth fighting for, which is why I've started with my little corner of it, which is sorting out the global warming nonsense. They were wrong on that. We can prove it. And I am going to make sure that that makes them think about how much else they're wrong about as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for speaking with us, Lord Monckton. It's been a pleasure. You're always incredibly insightful, and just your wealth of information is always very valuable. And I hope that the viewers enjoyed this as well. And if you don't, all the same, write below, and we will answer your comments accordingly. So thank you very much, sir, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you very much. God bless you. God bless America.
Do you like what you see here at Wham? Well, make sure to check the links below. GoFundMe, Patreon. We can't do it without you. Any donation is very much appreciated, especially as we are so vastly demonetized and censored by YouTube. You can also see our Bitcoin address in the description and the comments, as well as on the screen for you to scan, if you please. And also find us on steemit.com. That's steemit.com, the future of social media, where you get paid to blog via cryptocurrencies. You can find me at Josh Sigurdson. So we hope to see you there. But until next time, this is Josh Sigurdson signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.
Bye.